radical liberation is so anathema to me on a kind of fundamental level.
Yeah.
And yet it was perfectly clear for me, even in the very earliest years of my practices, that when I would go to like yoga studios and where people would say yoga and apparently be doing yoga, I actually thought that thing that happened in yoga studios was totally different from the thing. It was totally different from the thing that I was interested in. I actually didn't. I thought those people aren't interested in. Those people aren't. You trying to get me to unmute on the camera?
No, don't do that. You keep running, love, and then we'll. What the intention is that this is to give you a wonderful flavor. You get into the heart of it, Leila, like this incredible distinction between the source of yoga and what you experienced. What did you think was happening? That these people were.
I'm not going to say what studio I was going to, but it was a long time ago, right? It was in the late 90s, and I didn't know what it was, but it was perfectly clear to me that it had nothing to do with anything that I was learning. Because when I first came to yoga, it was tantric Buddhist yoga, right? It was Tibetan practices. That was my first committed meditation practice and first kind of committed school of inquiry. And I didn't have thinking. I was like, well, these two things. I mean, it was just obvious to me to the point where it wasn't even worth discussing. And this is one of those things where I realize now that the folks who were doing the yoga asana didn't think that they were doing something that was pointing them away from what I was. They thought they were pointed towards the same thing, but to me, it was just like instantly clear. And I was only 23 years old.
You could see it. And you could feel it, because my sense is that you were actually involved in a practice that was genuinely liberatory. But what you stepped into in that studio is a commodified practice that's been entirely kind of appropriated and colonized. And you know what I'm going to do, Leila? I think this is so exciting that we need everyone to see the full interview. We've got like a half hour set aside, but we're not going to do it all here. We just wanted to get a bit squeaky and excited and let you know that we're having this conversation, and you know where we're going to put the whole conversation up on our Yoni Shakti the Movement YouTube channel, and then people will be able to share it, because we have friends in the campaign in Facebook that we can't get live on that page right now. So I'm like, if you wanted a juicy trailer for why you need to hear every word that Leila says now for the next 20 minutes, that was it. We're going to pause this live here. I'm really thankful for everyone being here. You can check out YoniShaktiTheMovement.com, and then you'll be able to find where the rest of the interview is. And Leila, do you want to give the place where they can find your work in case they don't happen, if they've been under a stone for the last 10 years and haven't noticed what you're doing?
Leila Sadeghee here on Instagram. I have several, I have a whole bunch of things that I do. Vesselofworth.com is my sort of freewheeling, non-patriarchal, I don't say openly anti-patriarchal, but let's face it, anti-patriarchal spirituality practices that are not connected to the world of yoga, but are connected to the lands that I've lived on, and my ancestors came from on the British Islands descendant side. And I also am a part of Radical Darshan, and I strongly recommend that you go and follow at Radical Darshan. I'm a part of a new 300-hour yoga teacher training, and along with Leila Sadeghee, who I know had a takeover and with the Yoni Shakti, and is an amazing being, and other beings are involved with that, Lewis and Stacey Graham. So if you want to connect with me, Radical Darshan, at Leila Sadeghee on Instagram, and I'm around.
Beautiful. Okay, so thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing that. Go follow what Leila's about. We're going to continue a conversation in a kind of more relaxed, recorded way that you can check into on YoniShaktiTheMovement.com later. Okay, thank you, lovelies. So we're going to say goodbye to the Instagram folk, and I'm going to stop that now, and that will be bye. Bye. And I'm going to share that to the TV. So now I will ask you to unmute. We can get a little bit more formal here. So I think is that okay? Does that make sense?
I can't hear you because I stopped the Instagram part. So I'm back with you here.
Now, in a little more relaxed, formal way, because I feel sometimes with those live things, you have to kind of, but now we'll just pick up the threads and end up in the same place where you tell everyone where to find you and all that kind of thing. I'm going to just be a little more formal. Oh, I'm going to start, that's it. I'm going to that's it. So having made the time here, I'd love to sort of prioritize the focus on the work that you've done, Leila, it's like this word of being surprised by the reclamation.
Yeah.
Why does yoga need to be reclaimed? Why does it need to be reclaimed? What's your take on that?
I mean, it doesn't, if you kind of, pay any attention to what the yoga is saying that it is. I mean, I guess it just depends. Like, I mean, it's hard for me to also relate to the way that things are in a certain kind of way, just straightforwardly, because I've been here for a few years. I know that now how different it must be for someone to come into yoga for the first time. And it's look, I kind of think with the teacher's game and with the getting connected to spiritual practices game, it's always a little bit the luck of the draw, right? I mean, it's always a little bit like you just, something either subconsciously or consciously comes through, you find yourself in the studio or in the meditation hall or in that you find yourself being invited to a gathering or something happens, Nowadays, it's a lot more like kind of in your face, and it's a lot sort of more normal to have an energy healer and have a kind of, a kind of packet of crystals and all these sorts of things before you might even like really get connected with the yoga practice. So there's just quite a lot of, I want to say, in the best way of saying it would be to say, well, there's a lot of information, and the kind of the shadow of that is that there's a lot of noise. And it's hard to discern. And, it's like no surprise that in tantric practice, like one of the absolute highest, most significant practices that you're being encouraged to constantly do is discernment. You're constantly being asked to discern what is the best thing for right now? What is the pivot that I need to make on the path that's going to allow me to access the desired goal? And from my perspective, it's really, maybe what I would say is if I could if I could help out anybody who is at the beginning of their journey, it's to help them figure out what that goal is from an even earlier place. Because that's what's missing, I think, in a lot of the mainstream yoga culture, which obviously is very, very extracted, is involved in lots of different layers of exploitation, is heavily appropriated. It's a very there's a lot of shadow right under the surface, very close to the surface.
Yeah. And there's a paradox here, because the tools of discernment are the ones that we cultivate through the practice. So at the beginning of the practice, where do we go for people who are coming into this extraordinary field that might be like the most highly commodified, franchised system of like, as far away from like deep, authentic yoga practices you can make. And they might stumble into your class or stumble into, a practice. But supposing people have like, what's the compass that guides people? It might be luck of the draw, but if you end up in a space, how can you smell, do you think, what's authentic?
I mean, I feel like that, there's a lot of ways to answer that. I think I could give advice is one answer. Another answer is just to say, like, it's going to be completely dependent upon your samskaric tendencies, like really, I think that if I were to give advice, I would say to take I think if I were to give, like, I would maybe construct like a little sheet for people who were just starting out that would sort of say, like, let them list in their own experience already times that they felt taken advantage of, exploited, gaslit, all of these things. And I would ask them to write all those things down, and then to really consider the history of those experiences, like what the first point of contact with that circumstance was, what happened in their body, so that they undisappear the process for themselves, so that they really understand how this little seed grows into be like this sort of tree of distortion. And then from there, then to say, okay, so now you have an idea of what happens inside you, and also to learn like what your tendencies are, like where is your container having a little bit of the weakness. So we all have it, right? We've all grown up in imperfect homes with bless them parents who bless them, ancestors who bless them, did their very best, but they have their constitutional weaknesses. And then some of them have been passed on. Some of them we've developed through the particular circumstances of our family of origin upbringing. And then to kind of like really learn the shape of your container, which obviously I think also I would, totally agree. That's just part of what practice is. But maybe people need like a pre-practice practice nowadays. If folks, that would be like a useful thing to put out there. Like, here's what you need to know if you're going into spiritual cultures.
Absolutely. And my sense that you have identified like what's at the key for how so much of the abuse that has arising in terms of like the imbalance of power dynamics within certain kinds of yoga teaching lineages and with certain kinds of teachers. And what I saw was that the stories coming out of that, like looking for healing, involved exactly what you're saying, like looking back and saying, oh, how could that have happened? Like sometimes like the discernment isn't there because it's been disappeared, it's been buried in under layers of trauma and layers of conditioning and layers of don't trust yourself and layers of patriarchy, and it's so deep. And one of the profound things that I really think you're articulating with clarity is that it's almost, I feel sometimes there's a kind of enemy within us. There's misogyny and racism and white supremacy all around, and we can name it on the outside and say, that's not fair, that's unjust, that's wrong. And then honestly, sometimes, looking within the work, I know that you were really moved in your kind of journey through the work of Me and White Supremacy of Leila Sadeghee, trying to actually understand that within us, there's a real call to bring that light of discernment to understand how we can get caught up in some of these abusive situations that are so damaging. Yeah. I mean, and what I sense is the work you're doing is equipping people with the tools of liberation, both to liberate oneself, one's practice, and then to extend that out into the world, like with this. Could you speak a little about the vessel of worth and how it works to really honor and hold a space for self-inquiry through practice?
Sure. Well, as far as vessel of worth goes, I mean, vessel of worth is really a kind of very much a freestyle. It's a very much a temple of cat people who are finding their own way in community. I mean, I think that fundamentally, like the kind of rudiments of our craft are in the traditional spirituality of the British Isles and all really like indigenous spirituality of all over the world. But I'm coming through the priestess lineage of Avalon and with an influence in the Celtic priestess threads in what I've learned from teachers, and also just kind of years of dabbling in practical solitary magic. I can put it like this, by way of sharing a little of my own history and what led to all of this, is that I used to think that the big heavyweight kind of spirituality practices of the Tibetan Buddhist canon and the Shaiva Tantra and the Shrivijaya Tantra and all these sorts of things were like the kind of real, kind of heavily articulated actual paths that actually lead to actual enlightenment. And that the best thing to do is to get close to people who are either coming through those Zen Buddhism as well, like coming through those lineages with a state of awakening, so they can offer you both the experiential background, clear sight on the nature of my own character, and also the knowledge base of how to kind of navigate these systems and these practices. I thought that would be like the path of enlightenment. And that what I was doing with like the kind of magic and the earth-based spiritual practices and all of my interest in ritual and all that kind of stuff is that I thought that was like how I had fun in my spiritual practices, if that makes sense. Like that was my that actually like, now I look at that distinction and I think how powerful, white supremacist patriarchal, it's not in this case necessarily even white supremacist, it's really just patriarchal spirituality had kind of like really taken a deep root. That view had taken such a deep root in my system and was so kind of like fostered in my approach. And of course, it's like connected to, thinking that I'm going to get a better education in life if I, go to a certain kind of school than if I just live, which is, all these things are the same kind of distortion. Actually, I see a kind of correlation there. But anyway, and then it came to the point where I started to have what I call my white supremacist patriarchy meltdown. And when that happened, it was such a big melting down, and it was so kind of like many years of issues just like kind of exploded for me, inside me, and also in my life. And at that time, I just had to deconstruct all these notions that I had, that doing it this way means you're going to get this result, that like following these lineages means that this is more, that understand this really what I see now is just a false understanding that this lineage is going to necessitate that you get to a certain place, which is definitely what I've been told regularly by a lot of different people who were very august practitioners, who spoke so beautifully, who seemed to know so many things, who are actually appeared to be pretty high on the integrity spectrum, in their behaviors. So there are a lot of good reasons to listen to those folks. But I will say that, they were almost all men, and almost all white men, who definitely none of them had, they weren't white men with white teachers really, but none of them had white male teachers, but they all were white men that I was sort of getting information from. So it's just interesting how these cocktails kind of form themselves. We start thinking about it like a cocktail of ideas, and like, and then you're like, oh, so you can't really get this. You're talking about a vodka-based cocktail. Like, even if you if you see the metaphor, like, even if I'm going to stick like all of that kind of non-white practices inside the cup that is the cis white man at the very top of the privilege hierarchy, you're still going to get the flavor of that particular, of the matrix of that privilege inside the transmissional offering, the transmissional dispensation of that teacher. So anyway, I finally deconstructed all of this, or began to deconstruct, because it's now maybe the rest of my breath's work of life, because it's a big deconstruction. But as I did that, I kind of reversed, and I started to see how actually that there was a complete bandwidth of my direct understanding of myself and of reality that I completely bypassed when I invested in these systems. And to that end, like I knew immediately at age 23, as I was mentioning on our Instagram, when I went into yoga studios, that whatever was going on there had nothing to do with the enlightenment that I was reading, about, that Sogyal Rinpoche was speaking on. These were not, I was like, okay, this is not the same thing. And I just thought everybody knew that, and it was a real shock to me to understand that people thought they were going to kind of down dog their way into enlightenment. I mean, it just seems absurd to me at this stage. But it just seemed like anathema to me then. Anyway, so all of that deconstruction, just at that time, I'd also, one of my teachers had offered this priestess immersive experience to kind of go deeper into priestessing, which is kind of the thing that I always innately and intuitively was doing. And I knew how to do. I mean, she was the first person who named what I was doing for me. And I didn't really understand what I was doing. I just was doing what I was doing. And she was also someone, this is Sienna Sherman. She was somebody for whom I had a lot of respect for her. And so I really trusted her. Anyway, I went in this immersive time. And as I went through this, I started to understand that these practices are no less practices of enlightenment than any other practices. And in fact, what the vital and crucial reclamation for any body that is not carrying the status of the very height of entitlement in this oppressive world order in which we are enmeshed and entrenched, would maybe need something like this to be able to actually start to get free, which is really like, it's a little bit like jumping off a cliff, because you've got to jump off the cliff of your own truth and what your own system is telling you. And of course, on the way, you have to face every distortion of your own self-doubt. And that's it. That's the vessel of worth. The vessel of worth reflects the tantric understanding that, like, the primary issue that happens for the peoples is that there's a lack of understanding of the intrinsic and fundamental auspiciousness of being and of worth of the being. This is, of course, Uma, I'm speaking of the Anava Mala. And when the influence of the Anava Mala is such that the perfection of our own being is completely concealed, and every kind of experience of life seems to be, until we start to pick it apart or not trust it in that way, every experience of life will reflect it in some way. So there's definitely a kind of the influence of all of my studies and my practices in the vessel of worth. But the vessel of worth is daily ritual practice, it's community ritual practice, and most significantly, and I think this speaks more to the Maya Mala, the understanding that there isn't an enlightenment, there isn't going to be an awakening that isn't collective. Like, unless I'm able to really genuinely claim the bodies that aren't this body that's the most proximal to my sense of the I, and really claim it as a real deep reality, as a profound embodied reality, that I cannot be awake, that I cannot be free. And that understanding just gets stronger and stronger as years go by, and for me, and that's very present also in the Vessel of Worth sisterhood.
That's like, it's the awakening, that collective call for liberation is like at the heart of the Yoni Shakti the Movement campaign. There's this interface of that actually the practice itself awakens within an awareness of our interconnectivity.
Yes.
And that I'm interested to hear, like, how you've worked through now, perhaps with your work with Radical Darshan, because to me that seems like an intersection of the work that you're doing, and then Janelle and Kali and the other people involved. Because how did that come about? Because I'm sure there's many people within this Yoni Shakti the Movement campaign who have an interest in seeing, especially people who've been through a damaging experience with some traditional patriarchal yoga teaching process, or maybe a damaging experience within some very commercial and commodified yoga space. It can be, because some of the traditional ones, can be very damaging, and then some of these kind of newfangled franchise, there's many kinds of damage. So I bet there are people listening in going, well, supposing we've eradicated abuse and stepped outside of those damaging environments, where else can we go to see the uplift and reclamation happening? And one of them is in Radical Darshan and the work you're doing there. Would you like to speak a little about that and how that came about?
Yes. Well, it definitely came about because Janelle called Kali and Dr. Stacey Graham and I in and said, I think it's time. It's just kind of, we've got to do something. And so we formed this advanced yoga teacher training, which is really also just open to it could be open to anybody who's holding this a seat of commitment, really, and wants to turn to it. I feel that this is, if I were to come to something like Radical Darshan, and after an experience of damage, then I would say that what you could get in this 300-hour advanced yoga training is the seat of responsibility that allows you to feel that the power of your own responsibility. And I feel that again is often like, that's the bypass thing. And in a lot of these harm situations, there's that crucial projection of one's power and agency out onto somebody who's sitting on some kind of a pedestal, whether it's an individual or a group of people, or even just a kind of conceptual matrix that is sort of then embodied by a large group, that in that, then there's also a bypassing of a tremendous amount of responsibility for yourself, how you function in the world, how you are choosing to either uphold these systemic oppression or are able to have the agency to begin to resist it and to take it apart and to challenge it and to do what I would say is sort of what you have dharmically an option, what you have a dharmic opportunity to do, whoever you are. And so this is really a handing back of that power and agency through the uptake of that responsibility and seeing your own choices in that light. So Radical Darshan is centered in justice and equity. And it's centered in understanding how through, and it's really more through the Samkhya system that it's being kind of laid out formally, but how the kind of teachings of yoga are teachings for liberation that doesn't exclude justice. It doesn't bypass the reality of what our bodies are experiencing in our togetherness, in our communities, and in our everyday life.
That's beautiful. Yeah, so the inspiration that there is the possibility for uplift and connection is there in the trainings that you're offering. And there was the last topic I'd love to hear you speak about, because I'm aware that like self-care, like ritual practices, but self-care is at the heart of a lot of what you've been able to transmit and to share. Would you like to, and that's always been at the heart when we're thinking even about setting up this campaign and encouraging people to engage in what can become quite demanding, and sometimes it can be distressing work sometimes to uncover these experiences within or to share them. So I was always keen, like for me, yoga nidra is a key part of self-care. So we incorporated that within the campaign, but there are so many other ways for people to practice that kind of self-respect and self-care. Would you like to speak a bit about how it is part of your Radical Darshan, the self-care practices?
Yes. I mean, I think we would probably use the phrase resourcing practices. And this is because of the way that self-care as a term is very highly charged and politicized. And I have to say, from my own background in leading, I've led for years a community called The Practices, around the practices of freedom and well-being immersion, which is a course I've run now for the past nearly a decade, and the practices of leadership and empowerment yoga teacher training. And I was using this phrase self-care before it was like this sort of what it is now. And I was thinking that it was radical to kind of like frame, like at that time it felt, I don't know, radical seems a little strong, but like I was definitely thinking that I wanted to both bait people who were interested, who knew there was a thing there, and get them to see how much responsibility it actually is once they get into it. But there's a little bit, because I come, and I'm sure you must remember this, Uma, like now you can be a lot more like direct about what the actual thing was. For years I felt like in spiritual practice, it was like offering spiritual practice, it was a little bit like a bait and switch, where you kind of have to say like, you're selling it and you're saying that it is these things, and it is these things, but like the thing is that really what it is that you have to be with yourself. You have to do this thing that you find the hard, because that's the thing I think folks find the hardest, is to really be with their own energy, to be present to what their energy is doing and what it's doing now and what it's doing in this ongoing basis. So anyway, I came through that stream of the idea of self-care, but definitely have been very moved to start to kind of not use that terminology as much, because of the way that it's been, even, self-care is now at this point, I think kind of, really that orientation towards self-care. I mean, there's definitely a culture that is, grew in the past decade as well, particularly in the past kind of 4 or 5 years, where self-care is something that has to be preserved and protected at all costs. And then it becomes, okay, well, I'm just going to completely bypass the fact that this other part of me, who is this other person here, who's also me, is now going to be left out, excluded. I'm going to push this part away, so that I can preserve, this notion that I have of my own well-being. And of course, I'm speaking of the work of white wellness, and what that has become now at this point, and so in Radical Darshan, many of the practices are practices to offer resource. And we're very clearly naming the practice of grief labor. And by this term, I refer to a practice of actually turning to and engaging with and allowing yourself space to experience the natural grief that ensues when you wake up to just what the oppression really is, how oppressed you and the people and the other people who you share this planet with actually have been and continue to be, what your involvement has been, what you have offered at the altar of the great maw of oppression. All of these things, like there's a grief in that. Like we've given our life into a system that not only hasn't rewarded like an astonishing majority of those of us who are breathing air on the planet, who even have breathed air on the planet through the history of humanity, but also is actively causing harm in so many different directions, even just like in any given moment. So it takes time to grieve that. And so resources like Yoga Nidra, like yin practices that I know are really significant for Kali Scott's kind of offering in the way that she articulates how to move through these practices of yoga and how to give yourself the right support. And then just the straight up naming of like the tears the tears you shed. And what I call it is, I'm naming also, it's the time that I've spent on the floor. Like, it's like, there are some days that I can't do anything. Like, I just can't, I'm flattened by it. I'm flattened by the energy of oppression. I'm flattened by all of it. And so and I recognize that my body is undertaking the grief of it. So, and we know anybody who's lost, most everybody's lost somebody. And if the closer that person is, you know very well how that lays you out and you lose days. And then, those of us who are here to mend these, make amends in these circumstances, we're going to be laid out sometimes. And then how do we serve the people who are going to be more laid out because they're more hurt, depending upon our relative position, our social location, our points of privilege. So these are all issues that are a part of the weaving that is Radical Darshan.
And that word weaving, Leila, that is like, to me, it's not a metaphor. It's actually a reality of what I see the work that you're doing and the whole interconnectedness and intersection, the need for the intersectionality of everything that's occurring, because each person within this system of oppression is harmed. Everybody is harmed in ways that require the cultivation of these resourcing practices. And it is a much better term, because actually what you're hoping to do, I'm seeing, is that as well as the people who are practicing them, learning how to share those, like, you can't do that work when you're flattened out. Like, you're carrying a burden, different levels of burden, different, examining those things is it takes time and space. So I'm really honoring what it is that you've shared, because I feel that now is such a time to be able for people to see the possibility of this coming together, this weaving that you're talking about. And I wish Radical Darshan all success and and wide awareness. I'm hoping this spreads the awareness of what you're doing. And I'm wondering if there's anything else that you'd like to say, bearing in mind that we're making this interview primarily for the Yoni Shakti, the movement campaign to eradicate the abuse of women and reclaim yoga, but there'll be other people watching in. If there was one last message you would want to give about the kind of work you're endeavoring to share in the world, and like to end.
Oh my gosh. Well, I don't know what I have to say, actually. I'm in such a funny place right now. I really am. Isn't it? I mean, isn't it so amazing? Because here we are in the pandemic, and in the ending days of this phase of the pandemic. Like, whatever happens in the future, this, we know that, like, we're in the UK, on the verge of opening again, and things are shifting, and we'll of course see what happens with the vaccinations and the world and all of this. We don't know what will happen still, but I feel that everybody has undergone such astonishing shifts. I guess if I were to close with anything, then I would close with an invitation to a community that honors you. And I hope that folks, anyone who hears this, I hope that you are able to find community to be in support of whatever your process is right now. That's what I would say is the necessity of community for the process, and the necessity of a community that genuinely where profound respect for the multiplicity of experiences is really enshrined, because that's really, really missing from a lot of the yoga framework. Yoga likes to exclude itself from a lot of the sort of ordinary kind of rules of engagement. And while that on one hand can be a positive thing, that's also can cause a lot of harm. And so yeah, what would we say, like trust that gut of yours. If you're seeing, look around in your community, like who's there, who's centered, how does it feel? And if you have it's also like, I mean, I really want to honor this movement in Yoni Shakti, because it's so important that folks know that they can, that we don't have to simply trade this sanctity of our being in order to be a part of spiritual community, in order to gain access to our own birthright.
Yes. Well said, Leila. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
So delighted to have had the chance to speak with you. I'm deeply grateful for the time that you've made, and yeah, I'm hoping that everybody will be able to follow up with the work that you're doing at Radical Darshan.
Yes.
That's the best place, you said, for people to find out.
I think what I can do is, because you're going to put this on the YouTube, I'll just like give you all the
links beneath, and we'll put those in. But it's been an honor and a delight to listen to you speaking, and I send you a big hug from across the Atlantic.
Hug. Blessings. Thank you.
Stop this recording now, and we'll be sharing it with our Yoni Shakti the Movement.co YouTube channel. So that recording has stopped. Thank you.